My wife was the one who suggested the trip, and that should have been the first thing that made me uneasy. For months she had barely looked up from her phone, barely touched me, barely spoken to me unless it was about bills, errands, or something that needed fixing. Then all of a sudden she wanted a romantic weekend away to reconnect. At the time, I thought maybe I was getting my marriage back. I didn't realize I was being led somewhere she needed me not to ask the right questions. My name's Travis. I'm 39, I work as a project manager for a commercial flooring company outside Atlanta, and for most of my marriage I believed that if things got distant, you leaned in. You didn't run. You didn't punish silence with more silence. You stayed steady until the person you loved felt safe enough to come back. That belief cost me more time than I like admitting. My wife, Claire, and I had been married for 9 years. No kids. Just the two of us in a 2-story house with a cracked driveway, a half-finished guest room, and a marriage that had slowly gone from warm to functional without either of us ever saying the exact moment it changed. Claire worked in corporate recruiting for a healthcare network. She was good at it too. Sharp, polished, the kind of woman who knew how to make strangers feel chosen in under 5 minutes. That used to be one of the things I loved about her. She made life feel brighter when she wanted to. The problem was, after a while, she stopped wanting to around me. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, I probably would have fought harder earlier. No, it came in slow pieces. She stopped greeting me at the door. Stopped leaning against me on the couch. Stopped reaching for me in bed unless I initiated, and eventually even that started feeling like I was stepping into a room where I was no longer invited. The kisses got shorter. Then rarer. Then mostly gone. The conversations flattened out too. Instead of asking how my day was, she'd ask whether I remembered to transfer money into savings or whether I had called the plumber back. We still lived together. We still functioned. But everything between us started sounding like management. I told myself it was stress. That was always my first explanation. Claire's job had gotten heavier over the past year. New regional director. Higher targets. More travel. More late-night calls with candidates in different time zones. She came home drained, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? That's your wife. If she says she's exhausted, you don't start building theories. You pick up more around the house. You make dinner. You try not to become one more demand standing in front of her. So that's what I did. I cooked more than I used to. Took over groceries most weeks. Cleaned the kitchen after dinner while she sat on the couch half watching a show and half scrolling her phone. I suggested date nights a few times, but those usually got delayed. Maybe next week. Maybe after this big hiring push ended. Maybe once she got through the end of the quarter. There was always another professional emergency waiting conveniently between her and the marriage. The bedroom was where it hurt the most, though. Not just because of sex. People always reduce it to that. It was the rejection itself that did the damage. I'd get into bed and try something small, a hand on her waist, a kiss on her shoulder, a simple touch that should not have felt like crossing enemy lines in my own house. She'd tense up almost immediately. Then came the usual reasons. She was tired. She had a headache. She had a long day. She just wanted to sleep. It was never a fight. That almost made it worse. It was too practiced for that. Too smooth. Like my wife had learned how to shut me down with the minimum amount of visible cruelty. The strange part was she still had energy. Just not for me. I noticed that first with her phone. Claire had always used her phone a lot, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then I started noticing the way her whole face changed when it lit up. She could spend an entire dinner answering me and clip little fragments, then glance at the screen and suddenly there'd be life in her expression again. A real smile. A quick laugh. A softness that had disappeared from the rest of our life. I asked about it a few times early on, and she always had an answer ready. Work chat. Recruiter threads. Group messages. Social media. Something dumb somebody posted. I wanted to believe her because the alternative made me feel foolish in ways I wasn't ready to name. Then one Thursday in early September, after another week of careful distance and hollow routine, she surprised me. I came home around 7 and found candles lit in the dining room. Nothing fancy, just 2 on the table and takeout from that Italian place she used to love before everything between us got reduced to logistics. Claire was dressed nicer than usual too. Not formal, just softer. Hair done. Makeup light. A blouse I hadn't seen in months. For a second, it hit me right in the chest. Hope. That stupid, loyal reflex men like me keep long after it starts humiliating us. We ate together, and for the first time in a while she seemed present. Not fully, but more than usual. She asked about work. Actually listened when I answered. Even smiled once when I told her about one of my installers nearly dropping an entire box of tile samples into a fountain outside a client site. Then, toward the end of dinner, she looked down at her wine glass and said she thought we needed time away. Not a break. Not space. A getaway. She said we had both been off lately. Said life had gotten too heavy and too repetitive and maybe we needed to get out of the house, out of our routine, and remember how to be us again. She had already found a place too. A boutique resort in the North Georgia mountains, about 2.5 hours away. Spa, hiking trails, private cabins, all that curated peaceful nonsense built to make struggling couples feel like scenery can do the work their marriage no longer can. I should have been suspicious that she came to me with the whole thing already packaged. Instead, I felt relieved. That's how starved I was by then. A woman can go cold on you for months, and the second she offers one warm gesture, your heart starts reaching before your brain catches up. I said yes right away. She smiled at that, but even then there was something restrained in it. Not joy exactly. More like satisfaction that I hadn't made it difficult. At the time, I thought she was just nervous. Maybe she had finally realized how far apart we had gotten and didn't know how I'd react. The trip was set for the following weekend. And for the next several days, I did something I hadn't done in a while. I looked forward to my own marriage. That part is still hard to admit. I started picturing long drives with the windows cracked and music low. Quiet dinners without phones. Maybe one real conversation. Maybe a reset. Maybe whatever had gone cold between us had not died yet, only gotten buried under routine and stress and all the ordinary things people blame when they're scared to say the bigger word. Claire, on the other hand, didn't act excited. She acted organized. That difference only started bothering me when it was too late. She made the reservation, printed the confirmation email, planned the route, packed early, and kept her phone closed the entire week. Every time I tried to turn the trip into something emotional, something hopeful, she answered with practical details instead. Check-in time. Weather forecast. Whether I wanted to leave Friday evening or Saturday morning. It was like she was producing a weekend, not anticipating one. Still, I ignored it. Because hope makes liars out of lonely men too. The Friday before we left, I came upstairs early and found her standing by the dresser with her suitcase open, phone in hand, smiling down at the screen. Not a big smile. Just one of those small private ones that told me someone, somewhere, had reached the part of her I'd been trying to get back for months. She didn't hear me at first. Then I stepped into the room, and the smile disappeared so quickly it barely looked human. She locked the phone, set it face down on the dresser, and asked if I had packed my charger. I said yes. But I stood there looking at her, at the half-zipped suitcase, at the phone she suddenly couldn't leave alone, and for the first time since she suggested the trip, I felt something colder than hope slip in. Because my wife looked like a woman preparing for a weekend with me. But she didn't look like a woman who wanted to be there. We left Saturday morning just after 9. Claire said the traffic would be better if we got out before lunch, and she was probably right, but the way she said it fit the pattern from that whole week. Everything about the trip was being handled like a project. Departure time. Fuel stop. Check-in window. Dinner reservation she had somehow already made for that evening. On paper, it should have looked thoughtful. A wife planning a romantic weekend to save a marriage. In reality, sitting in the driver's seat while she adjusted the navigation on her phone without even glancing at me, it felt more like I had been assigned a role in something she needed to keep moving on schedule. Still, I tried. That was my mistake for a little while longer. I had coffee in the cup holder, an old playlist on low, the mountains ahead of us, and for the first 40 minutes I kept telling myself not to ruin the chance she had offered. Maybe she was just tense. Maybe planning the whole thing had made her anxious. Maybe once we got out of the city and into the quiet, whatever had been wound tight between us would start to loosen. She spent most of the drive on her phone. Not constantly. That would have been easier to call out. No, Claire was too polished for that. She had mastered the rhythm of partial attention. A few minutes looking out the window. Then down at the screen. A quick reply. A small smile. Then back to neutral by the time I looked over. When I tried to make conversation, she answered, but the answers came clipped and thin, like the real conversation was happening somewhere in her hand and I was just the soundtrack between notifications. At one point, about an hour in, I asked if she could maybe leave the phone alone for a bit. Not accusing. Not sharp. Just honest. She gave a little sigh and said she was wrapping up one work thread so the weekend could actually be relaxing. That sounded reasonable enough that I felt stupid immediately. So I nodded and kept driving. 20 minutes later, She was still texting. The resort was exactly the kind of place people choose when they want to pretend a nicer backdrop can substitute for intimacy. Private cabins tucked into the hills. Stone walking paths. Fire pits. Soft instrumental music drifting out of the main lodge. Everything smelled like cedar and lavender and expensive marketing. Couples everywhere. Matching hiking boots, hands linked, wine glasses on porches, people performing closeness so naturally it made me feel overdressed in my own marriage. Claire smiled for the first time all day when we pulled in. Not at me. At the place. That distinction started bothering me the second I noticed it. Check-in took maybe 10 minutes. The woman at the desk gave us our room keys, explained the spa packages, trail maps, breakfast hours, all of it in that soothing voice hospitality people use to make you feel like calm is something they can hand you. Claire nodded, asked 2 practical questions about dinner timing, and checked her phone while the woman was still talking. I stood there with the keys in my hand realizing my wife could not stay off that screen long enough to fake full presence through check-in at a romantic mountain resort she had chosen. Our cabin was pretty, I'll give it that. High ceiling. Stone fireplace. King bed. Big soaking tub in the bathroom. A private deck that looked out over trees already starting to turn gold at the edges. The kind of place that should have made 2 people feel lucky to be alone together. Instead, the second we got inside, Claire set her bag on the bench near the door, walked straight to the window, and checked her phone again. Not because she thought I wasn't watching. Because by then she didn't seem to care enough to hide the pattern well. I asked if there was some emergency at work. She said no without looking at me, then added that people still had questions even when she was technically off. That technically sat with me for a minute. Then I asked, so are you off, or not? She turned then, phone still in her hand, and gave me the tired expression I had started seeing more and more at home. The one that made it look like my reaction to her behavior was the draining part, not the behavior itself. She said she was trying, but if I was going to make every little thing into an issue, the trip was going to be pointless. That shut me up for a while. Not because she was right. Because I had heard some version of that line so many times by then that my brain still half believed it. That maybe I really was too tuned in. Too hungry for meaning. Too ready to interpret distance as danger because I couldn't accept that marriage just gets quiet sometimes. So I unpacked. Put my shaving kit in the bathroom. Hung a couple shirts in the closet. Moved through the cabin like a man pretending he was on the trip he thought he signed up for. Claire unpacked too, but with a kind of distracted efficiency that made the whole thing feel off. She wasn't settling in. She was staging herself between phone checks. Around 4, I suggested we take a walk before dinner. She said sure, but the yes came late, like she had been pulled out of another thought first. We followed one of the shorter trails behind the lodge. Gravel path, pines, little wooden signs pointing toward scenic overlooks and meditation gardens. It should have been easy. Quiet. The kind of walk where a couple can either reconnect or at least feel the shape of each other again without all the noise of ordinary life pressing in. Claire stayed half a step ahead of me the whole time. That sounds small, but it matters. Married people either fall into rhythm without noticing or they don't. She didn't. And twice during that walk, her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket and both times I watched her whole body sharpen around it. Not with dread. With alertness. Interest. The second time, she actually stopped walking. She pulled the phone out, glanced at the screen, and smiled before she could shut it off. I saw it clearly. Not a work smile. Not relieved. Not burdened but handling it. A warm one. Private. She noticed me looking and immediately tucked the phone back into her pocket. Then she said it was just a vendor issue from an earlier requisition and asked if I thought we should do the longer trail tomorrow morning. That was the first moment on the trip where I felt something in me start cooling for good. Because the lie itself was bad enough. But what got me was how smooth the redirect was. She had already learned how to hand me a practical question the second I got too close to the emotional one. Weather. Dinner. Check-in. Trails. She was building an entire weekend out of logistics to keep me from naming what was wrong inside it. Dinner that night was worse. Not dramatic. Worse. We sat on the patio of the lodge restaurant with candles on the table and mountain air coming in cool through the trees, and Claire felt miles away. She was polite. Asked me about work. Even touched my wrist once when the waiter poured wine, like she remembered she was supposed to look married in public. But her attention kept slipping. Phone on her lap. Tiny glances down. One excuse to get up and use the restroom that took long enough for me to watch the candle burn lower and realize I was alone on a romantic patio waiting for my wife to finish whatever conversation mattered more than this trip she had insisted we take. When she came back, she looked lighter. That was what hurt. Not guilty. Not flustered. Lighter. Like stepping away from the table had allowed her to breathe. I asked if everything was okay. She said yes. I asked if she was sure. She smiled that thin, careful smile and said, "Can we not do this here?" That phrase followed us home too, apparently. I let it go. Again. Back in the cabin later, I thought maybe the room itself might shift something. Fireplace lit. Night quiet outside. A bottle of wine half gone between us. She had changed into sleep clothes, hair down, face softer in the low light. For half a second, I saw the silhouette of the woman I married and remembered why lonely men stay hopeful longer than they should. I went over to her slowly while she stood by the dresser. Put my hand gently on her waist. Kissed her shoulder. She stiffened immediately. Then she turned just enough to say she was exhausted and wanted to get some sleep. Same tone. Same distance. New location. I took my hand off her and stepped back. A minute later, she was in bed facing away from me, phone glow on the wall again. That was when the trip finally started making sense. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Because this wasn't a healing vacation. Nothing about Claire felt like a woman trying to find her way back to her husband. She wasn't reconnecting. She was managing me. Keeping me occupied with scenery and reservations and the idea of effort while whatever had already started outside this marriage kept moving quietly behind the screen. And lying there in that expensive cabin, staring at the light from her phone flicker against the ceiling, I understood something that made sleep impossible. My wife had not brought me to the mountains to save our marriage. She had brought me somewhere pretty enough that I might not notice how absent she still was. I didn't sleep much that first night in the cabin. Not because Claire was snoring or because the bed was unfamiliar or because the mountain air felt different enough to keep my body on alert. I didn't sleep because every time I drifted off, that same blue-white glow behind me kept tugging me back up. The soft light on the wall. The tiny shifts of the mattress when she adjusted her position. The occasional little breath through her nose that sounded suspiciously close to amusement. At some point after midnight, I stopped pretending the trip still had anything to do with healing. By morning, I had made a decision. I was done trying to rescue the weekend. I was going to watch it instead. That changed the feel of everything. When Claire woke up, she acted normal enough for someone committed to the performance. She stretched, checked the weather on her phone before even saying good morning, and asked whether I still wanted to do the longer trail before breakfast. The question would have sounded thoughtful if I hadn't spent half the night staring at the glow of the same device she couldn't put down long enough to touch her husband without going stiff. I told her sure. Then I watched. She carried the phone in the pocket of her fleece the entire hike. Not always in her hand. That would have been too obvious. But every time it buzzed, her body reacted before her face did. A tiny lift of attention. A pause half a beat too long. Twice she angled slightly away from me before checking it, like even the pine trees needed to believe this weekend was still innocent. About halfway up the trail, we stopped at an overlook with a long stretch of blue hills rolling out behind the trees. The kind of place that exists to make people feel small in a peaceful way. Claire stood at the railing with one hand on the wood, phone in the other, staring down at the screen with that same private softness I'd been watching all week. I took a picture of the view. Then I took one of her. Not because I wanted the photo. Because I wanted to see whether she'd react differently to my attention than she did to whoever was in that phone. She looked up when she heard it and gave me a polite smile. Quick. Social. Almost the exact same expression she'd give a coworker asking for a team photo at a conference. I said she looked nice. She said thanks. Then her phone buzzed, and whatever had been on her face for me vanished instantly. That was when I stopped feeling wounded and started feeling cold. Because once the contrast gets that clear, heartbreak starts making room for investigation. Back at breakfast, I kept the conversation light on purpose. The weather. Whether we should check out the spa menu later. A couple at the next table arguing softly over hiking shoes. Claire responded just enough to keep the scene intact, but her phone stayed turned screen down beside her coffee cup, and twice she picked it up under the table and answered something while nodding at me like she was still present. Then she excused herself to take a quick work call. At breakfast. On a couple's trip. At a resort she had chosen to reconnect. I watched her walk through the lobby doors and out toward the side patio with the same weird, practiced urgency I'd been seeing all month. Not panic. Priority. She was gone 12 minutes. When she came back, she looked relieved. Not done with a stressful call. Relieved. I didn't confront her then. That part of me had finally learned something. Claire was ready for direct questions. Ready with answers. Ready to make me sound suspicious, needy, dramatic, All the words people use when the truth needs to stay blurry. If I was going to get the shape of what was really happening, it had to be before she had time to polish it for me. So I waited for a cleaner chance. It came that afternoon. Claire had booked us both massages at the spa, another detail that should have felt thoughtful but by then just felt strategic. Something to keep the trip moving. Something structured. Something with enough built-in separation that she'd have room to breathe away from me without it looking strange. We checked in, got robes, and sat in the waiting lounge while cucumber water and flute music tried too hard to convince everyone they were calm. Claire's phone buzzed once in the pocket of her folded jeans beside the chair. She froze for half a second, then casually reached over and muted it without checking the screen. That told me more than if she had answered immediately. Because by then she knew I was noticing something. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough that she had started adjusting around my awareness. She was no longer careless. She was careful under pressure, which meant whatever this was had already moved beyond harmless. A spa attendant came to get her first. She stood, smiled at me in that thin, visitor-safe way, and followed the woman down the hall. Her jeans were still draped over the chair, phone tucked in the front pocket. I sat there for maybe 5 seconds after she disappeared. Then I picked them up. I'm not going to dress that moment up as noble or tortured. I already knew what kind of line I was crossing. But people love abstract morality right up until their own life is being rearranged behind their back. I was done choosing blindness because it sounded cleaner. The phone wasn't locked. That's what shocked me most. Maybe she trusted the environment. Maybe she thought I'd never do it. Maybe her attention had gotten sloppy because she was busy maintaining the story of the trip itself. Whatever the reason, the opening was there. I took it. The message thread at the top wasn't saved with a full name. Just M. That alone made my stomach turn. No surname. No company tag. No safe label like Megan Work or Mad Vendor. Just a letter. The kind of thing people do when they want the phone to stay harmless looking if it lights up at the wrong time. I opened it. There weren't 1,000 messages. That would have been almost easier to process. No, it was a living thread with obvious gaps, which meant things had been deleted. But not enough. Not perfectly. A few were still there. Wish I was there instead of him. You'd hate this place lol. Too curated. Miss your face. Then lower down. You still have to play nice till Monday? And Claire's reply. Yes. Just get through it. I read that one 3 times. Just get through it. Not enjoy the trip. Not work on us. Not reconnect. Get through it. Like the whole weekend was an inconvenience she had to survive. Like I was not her husband on a healing vacation but a task standing between her and whatever was waiting back home. I scrolled farther. Another message from him. Did he buy the act? Her reply. Mostly. He wants this to mean something. That was the moment my chest actually hurt. Not because I still didn't know. I knew. Because those words told me exactly how I existed in her mind during the very trip she suggested. Not as a man she was trying to find her way back to. Not even as a problem she felt guilty about. I was the audience. The husband still invested enough to make the cover worth staging. I took quick screenshots and sent them to myself. Then I deleted the sent notification, locked the phone, slid it back into the jeans pocket exactly where it had been, and sat back in the chair just as another attendant came to get me. I don't remember much about the massage. Just the strange feeling of lying face down in a dark room while someone tried to unknot tension from my shoulders that had nothing to do with muscle. My wife was somewhere else in the same building, probably moving through the rest of the afternoon with the same composed face she'd worn all weekend, while the truth sat in my own phone now, undeniable and ugly. That was all I had for a name. But by then, the mystery wasn't whether there was another man. The messages had taken care of that. What I needed now was the full picture. Who he was. How long this had been going on. And most of all, whether this reconnecting trip had been her idea because she thought distance and scenery would keep me from seeing what was already in motion. By dinner, I had my answer to that last part. Claire was lighter than she had been the whole weekend. That happens sometimes once people think they've regained control of the story. They relax too soon. She even laughed once at something the waiter said and touched my arm lightly when we were deciding on wine, like she had suddenly remembered how to play warm. But now that I knew, every gesture looked staged. Every look, every smile, every polite little question felt like theater performed for a man she had already told someone else to just get through. I let her perform. Because by then I wasn't trying to fix anything. I was waiting for the moment she'd have to explain why she brought me into the mountains just to keep another man calm from a distance. I didn't confront Claire at dinner. That probably sounds strange after everything I had just seen on her phone. Another man reduced to one letter. Screenshots sitting in my pocket. Proof that this trip was never about us. Proof that while I was trying to breathe life back into my marriage, my wife was texting someone else about surviving the weekend with me. But I had learned something over the past few months. Claire did well with messy emotion. She knew how to redirect it, shrink it, make it look unreasonable. If I came at her in the restaurant, with candlelight and mountain views and couples all around us pretending their own lives were simple, she'd do exactly what she always did. She'd make me the disruption. The embarrassment. The man who couldn't keep it together. No. I was done giving her room she knew how to manage. So I waited until we got back to the cabin. She changed into sleep clothes, washed her face, and moved through the room with that controlled little calm she wore whenever she thought she had successfully kept things from sliding off script. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace and watched her without saying much. That seemed to throw her a little. Not enough to scare her yet. Just enough that I could feel her checking the emotional temperature of the room and not finding the cues she was used to. When she finally looked at me and asked if I was okay, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because of the nerve of it. I told her to sit down. That changed her face immediately. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She just sat on the edge of the bed and waited, and in that quiet little pause I knew she already sensed the trip had reached the point she'd spent the whole weekend trying to avoid. I asked who M was. She went completely still. Not confused. Not surprised in a general way. Specific fear. Then she asked what I was talking about. I told her not to do that. Not tonight. Not after the breakfast calls, the trail messages, the spa lounge, the dinner performance, and the texts about playing nice until Monday. I told her I had seen the thread. I told her I had read the part where she said she just needed to get through the weekend and the part where she said I wanted this trip to mean something. That was when the tears started. Fast. Silent at first. Just her face folding in on itself because the version of events she had been balancing all weekend was finally gone. But even then, the first thing she reached for wasn't honesty. It was damage control. She said it wasn't what it looked like. I asked her how exactly a husband is supposed to interpret another man texting his wife that he wished he was there instead of him. That landed hard enough that she looked down and stayed there. Then the truth started coming in pieces. His name was Mark. Not M as in harmless shorthand. Not some vendor. Not some recruiter thread bleeding too far into personal life. Mark. A physician liaison she had met through one of the recruiting projects 6 months earlier. It started with work calls, then lunches, then longer conversations, then the kind of emotional overlap people pretend just happened because it sounds less ugly than admitting they kept choosing it. I asked when it turned physical. She covered her face before answering, which somehow made it worse. 3 months. 3 months. That number hit me harder than I expected because it rearranged everything behind it. 3 months meant the coldness at home had not been random. The fake exhaustion. The turned shoulders in bed. The constant phone glow. The trip. None of it was confusion. None of it was stress. She had already moved the center of herself somewhere else and brought me to the mountains to keep me quiet while that second life stayed in motion. I asked why she suggested the trip. That was the question that finally broke her. Because there wasn't a clean answer to it. She cried and said things had gotten tense at home. Said she felt me noticing too much. Said she thought if we got away for a weekend, maybe it would reset things enough to buy her time while she figured out what she wanted. Buy her time. That was the reveal. Not just that she was cheating. That she had turned a romantic getaway into cover. She had not brought me there to heal anything. She brought me there because the trip itself was a prop. A story she could point to later if I got too close to the truth. Look, I tried. Look, I planned something for us. Look, I wanted to reconnect. Meanwhile she was texting another man from the bathroom, from the trails, from the spa, from the bed beside me, treating the whole weekend like an inconvenience she had to survive until she could get back to him. I asked her one more question after that. I asked whether she had ever actually planned to choose me on that trip. Not in theory. Not if the scenery worked. Not if the massages softened things. I meant really. Had there ever been a moment where she looked at me that weekend and thought, this is my husband, this is the man I want, let me stop what I'm doing and go home honestly? She didn't answer. She just cried harder. That was enough. I stood up, went to the closet, took my duffel bag out, and started packing. Not because I wanted some dramatic visual. Because I needed movement. Needed to do something with my hands while the last of the marriage turned into something final inside my chest. Claire kept saying we should talk more. That we shouldn't do this there. That we could still finish the weekend and sort things out at home. It was amazing, really. Even then, even caught that cleanly, part of her still wanted the optics of the trip preserved. Still wanted the staged version of effort to survive longer than the truth underneath it. I told her no. I said she could stay if she wanted. I was leaving. That shook her more than the confrontation had. Because I don't think she expected me to step out of the role she'd built for me. The patient husband. The one who kept trying. The one who could be managed with a little scenery and just enough hope. I left that cabin a little after 10 at night and drove back toward Atlanta through dark mountain roads with my bag in the passenger seat and screenshots of her affair sitting in my phone like a second heartbeat. The aftermath was ugly in practical ways and cleaner in emotional ones. Claire stayed at the resort that night, then came home the next day. We didn't scream. Didn't throw anything. By then there wasn't enough left for theatrics. Just logistics. Lawyers. Separate accounts. Explanations to family trimmed down to the least humiliating version of the truth. Mark disappeared from her life faster once it stopped being secret, which told me plenty about what that relationship actually was. The marriage ended within months. And looking back, the trip wasn't the moment my marriage broke. It was the moment I finally understood it had already been broken for a long time, and my wife just needed a prettier place to hide the wreckage.